increased risk of self-harm and suicide, and how the key to all this really is disclosure of past torture, because that informs the assessment. You need that trusting relationship in order to get the disclosure. You need very clear communication and informed consent. But healthcare professionals can be under so much pressure to comply with the processes required by the detention, to limit the time available. I was really horrified to talk to a prison doctor early on in this working party process who described what she does when she does a segregation round, they call it. So when anybody's held in segregation, there is a standing order that says the doctor must visit all those held in segregation once every 24 hours and within 2 hours of them first going in. So yeah, she did that. Every 24 hours she went round. The prison officer opened the door. She looked at the person, said, "How are you? Are you okay? Good." Closed the door. It was literally an "Are you alive?" yes, no question, and on they went. And she said it wasn't possible to spend any more time because the prison officers would be at her back, jangling the keys, "Come on, doc, that's enough, they're all right, no, they're just trying to manipulate you, no, don't spend any time with him, he's just a troublemaker," and so on and so on. There was no privacy, there was no adequate time spent, there was no proper communication, there was no relationship of trust, and so she was finding everyone, unsurprisingly, fit for continued segregation because she was performing this completely inadequate examination. And this drummed home to me really the need for these standards, because it's not enough to say the doctor has to visit every 24 hours. It should be enough, but unfortunately it clearly isn't enough. So we have to specify what the doctor should do when they visit every 24 hours, why they need to do that, how they need to do it, and how they can demonstrate that they have done it. So we've got these measures and the standards, which are quite detailed about what should be done to make sure that a proper process is carried out and that proper escalation of concern is made for all these different categories of consideration of unfitness for detention processes. And I even made them a nice flow chart so that it's really, really clear, in the hope they can laminate it, stick it on the wall, and remember to do it, to do their job. We made a separate section for children. Now, obviously, children shouldn't even be in these sorts of places of detention, but unfortunately, they sometimes are. Sometimes they say they're children, but the detaining authorities say they're not children. And there's a disputed age issue that's still going on in the UK, and unfortunately there's no presumption in favour of the child. The presumption is in favour of the assessment that they're not a child carrying more weight. So they get assessed by 2 social workers who will make some sort of declaration that they're not a child, and then they can be in an adult detention facility with much older adults. I had one case of a 15-year-old boy who was determined to be an adult. He spent 9 months in immigration detention, during which he was raped a number of times, even though he told healthcare that he had had sex with an adult, and they knew that he was declaring himself to be a child. Even then, alarm bells did not ring, and it was only when he got himself a better lawyer that he got out of detention. And I hope that that poor kid wins a really huge compensation settlement, because he bloody deserves it for what he went through. He didn't even know that what had happened to him was rape, because he was 15 and he didn't know that there's something like consent and an age of consent. He doesn't even know whether he's gay or not. That's the level at which he was operating, and the failure of those responsible adults to safeguard him from harm. So there's a lot of risks for children in this situation, and a lot of failures, sadly, of healthcare professionals to safeguard them. So we've had to just remind them of very basic things about children and what they should do and how they should be caring for them and safeguarding them appropriately. And then we have a section on mental health, because again, this is a big area where there are failures of proper assessment, there are presumptions of disbelief, attention-seeking behavior, and so forth. And the capacity assessment is linked to this. Particularly also, we need to make sure people are properly assessed for the risk of self-harm and of deterioration of their mental health through the time that they're in detention. So a lot of detail about the measures and standards for this. And finally, one on sexual violence, because as I said, this seemed to be something where bizarrely all normal healthcare practice seemed to be simply out of the window. If they're reporting historic sexual violence, they weren't being properly assessed at all, and so all of these things were not being done. So, what do I hope for out of all this work, which has been quite a labour? Improved treatment of health conditions, reduced frequency of adverse outcomes, self-harms and suicide, improved quality of life. I think above all to empower the healthcare professionals to maintain their ethical obligations. I don't think any of these doctors feel good about the shit work they're doing. I'd like to think that they're nice human beings who go home to loving families and pat their dog and do good things for their communities. They probably do, but they're doing terrible things in detention, and they need to be empowered and helped to do their job properly, to be the good doctors, which I'm sure they really are and would like to be. And we need to reduce vicarious trauma in this professional group so that patients can overall have a positive experience of care. I'm going to stop there in case you have questions.
Okay, so we do have a little bit of time for questions. So let's see, do we have any comments, questions for Dr. Cohen?
This is not a question, but rather sharing. We're not yet there, sorry. We're not yet at the quality healthcare for victims of torture. We're still struggling for access. That's the level of a very, very poor and very a country that is not that is not respecting human rights. So, but this is a very good sharing because we're still improving. We're there now in improving the protocols to accept victims of torture from the community to the hospital. So that is the level of healthcare for victims of torture. However, as I've said, access means for victims of torture to go and to be immediately treated, as well as to be documented and to be provided with services, together with other agencies of the government, which is under our anti-torture law. The 4 agencies comprises of Department of Justice, Department of Social Welfare, Department of Health, and Department of Commission on Human Rights. There are the 4 agencies that should implement everything about torture. Unfortunately, as I said, what they have done is just a referral system. What they have done is an understanding, signing of understanding that they have a part in relation to provide services to victims of torture. However, it is not fully implemented, which means there is a law, there is a policy, an internal policy, a procedural policy, but nobody access it yet. What they have immediately accessed, they can immediately access is the compensation. Once you cry for torture, you apply for compensation, they give you immediately the 10,000. 10,000 is, I think, $500, no? $500. Anyway, that is now being accessed. In relation to healthcare, that is still a struggle, and that is, it's very hard to do that, especially now. You cannot mobilize the security sector, the Department of Justice, the Department of Social Welfare. Not now, especially now. But thank you for this, because you will develop that eventually, I think. Sorry, we might be delayed for you, but that what she said is very true, my dears. And also we also have one contribution, I think, which is the participation of victims in relation, for example, children. We also ask them an assent. It's the consent and the assent of the child. Even though he's a child, you should leave some information, give that information to the child in some decision. We're training that also to children. We give assent or permit or information to children. That's what we have also done. And on the onset, we always like to provide empowerment, which means legal. If it is a legal, if it is done by a lawyer, we will ask the lawyer the full information on whether this case will be, what will happen to his case, immediately or the long term. For the doctor, what will be done to him first and foremost, and that's how we do it in relation to access. Access means going to the doctor or the lawyers or to have whoever will help him. That will be provided with treatment, or non-discrimination principle will apply also. So, and as I said, there's one struggle, very, very long struggle, that is compensation or immediate, who will pay for the expenses of that victim, because under our law, the victim have the right to choose the doctor and should be paid, all the expenses should be paid by the government. And so, but only compensation for accessing lawyers, or to pay for whatever is need to be paid. That is already built in the system, but not yet quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
So my question is really around, these guidelines are incredible, and I know that it's involved so much work from so many people, but also you were able to bring together the leading organisations in the field, working with the Royal College, which is incredible. So because we're all from different countries and we have different stages of where we are with our professional bodies. So if I can give the example in Hong Kong, where we have not been able to really work with the medical community. So we're very, very far away. We're like the Philippines. This is like a very long way to go till we have this. And so because, Juliet, you actually were here, what advice would you give, not only for us in Hong Kong, but others in other countries? How can we, as lawyers, actually be able to work with the medical body or the medical school or the regulators? Because it's a real issue, because we can't get into detention. Like, the lawyers in Hong Kong can't access detention unless it's your client who's already detained. So if you've got into detention without a lawyer, then you're waiting until you're released, till you can then go and tell someone what's happened to you in detention. And the situation of healthcare, we're not sure, because we don't have data, we don't have reporting, we don't have monitoring, we don't have, one of your slides, you're able to put up all these statistics, and we have none of that here. So just really for some advice for us who've been trying to work on this for 3 years now. Anything you can offer, pearls of wisdom?
I guess that is difficult. I think that if lawyers have an idea of what healthcare should be, then they can ask their clients, well, are you receiving this healthcare? What healthcare are you receiving? And if it is manifestly inadequate, then is there a process by which they can complain, or at least say, I've seen this person and their health is getting worse and worse and they don't appear to be getting any adequate treatment. Is there any way then in which that person can be considered for release. Yes, in the UK we are lucky to have other ways of publicising what's going on, because there are Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, and they will make regular announced inspections and unannounced inspections, and those are public documents. And there are visitor groups who will go in and see individuals and report on what they say, and all the doctors are individually accountable for the health care that they provide or don't provide. So one thing that lawyers can do, for example, is ask for a copy of the medical records. If someone has been to healthcare and thinks that they haven't had adequate treatment, they should be able to get a copy of the healthcare records, and then you can ask an independent doctor to go through those records and comment on them and say, do you think that this looks right? What's going on in these records? Have they had the right investigations and treatment? And then perhaps you can make a complaint about that. I don't know, because each country is going to be different about what powers you actually have, but having an understanding of what healthcare standards should be, I would hope would be helpful, and then any and every means to try to publicise where they're falling short, even if it does mean reporting individual doctors of negligent practice, and maybe that is the only way that you can achieve change.
Okay. One last comment.
Thank you very much for the summary there of what you've given. I'm a psychotherapist, and I've worked in offshore detention centres in mental health with torture survivors. I'm very familiar with a lot of the standards here. This is Australian offshore detention centres. It seems that the system breaks down very easily, and it's not to put a dampener on this. I think the standards are really important, but it seems to break down in that there's no political will to actually enforce the implementation of standards. I took your comment about why the medical practitioners behave in this way in detention centres, and it's something that I've asked myself continually, that a lot of them, manoeuvring my way around the medical facilities of our offshore detention centres. It seems to be that there's just a lack of belief and a lack of trust, and it's among medical professionals about the fact that asylum seekers are telling the truth. And there doesn't seem to be, again, any political will to change that perception. And so, as mental health advocates, if you like, what we get told is that this is a behavioural issue. It's all the things that you've said. I kind of feel like you've been sitting on my shoulder, looking over my shoulder while I've been wandering around watching. I'm dealing with the medical profession for the last 6 years. So we get told it's behavioural, it's manipulative. We don't reward bad behaviour, and here we're watching people disintegrate in front of them, and they're being accused of bad behaviour. It's a comment and a question: how on earth do we get the authorities to, or somebody, to instill some political will in actually making sure that these things happen? I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I cannot find the answer. So if anybody's got some ideas, it would be, I'd be really grateful.
Yeah, thank you. It is heartbreaking, isn't it, when you see what happens to people and this complete lack of care, and worse than a lack of care, but attributing it to bad behaviour. And I have struggled a lot with this as well, of what is going wrong with these places? How are medical professionals condoning behaving in this way? I think you're right, there isn't any political will to solve these sorts of problems. There's no votes in being nice to asylum seekers in any country in the world. That's not going to change anytime soon. So that's why I thought that we should go through the standards of healthcare, because I think that by going down this route, we have a chance to empower those doctors to demand the sort of working environment that allows them to do their job properly. So what happens at the moment in the UK is that they've got this process which supposedly safeguards torture survivors from being inappropriately detained, called the Rule 35 report. And what that means is that the doctor will see anyone who says, I've been tortured, write a quick report, it's only a few lines, it doesn't have to take them very long, saying, yep, he's got some symptoms and signs, yeah, he could be tortured. And the case owner is then supposed to review the need to detain them on the presumption that they could be harmed if the detention's maintained. What happens in practice is that the case owner says, either that's not good enough evidence, I don't believe they were tortured, or, well, even if they were tortured, I'm still going to maintain detention because you haven't said they'll be really harmed, or we're going to remove them soon, so who cares? Now, the doctor then has an obligation to read that response, sign it, and file it. And if they're not happy that that's the right response for their patient's best healthcare needs, to escalate their concern. What happens in practice is they never escalate the concern. And that's why I wanted to have such an emphasis here on helping people understand that they really have that obligation to demand that they have the proper time to make a proper healthcare assessment, and whenever things are not done according to what they say, that they should be escalating that concern, because the doctors, I think, are so isolated and under so much institutional pressure that they simply don't feel they have any power to change anything. And so they absorb all these negative thoughts and feelings about the people they're supposedly caring for. The culture of disbelief permeates everything that they do. And I think that by improving the sense of professionalism, building better networks, reducing vicarious traumatization in this group, that's the way that we can hope to empower them to actually do the job that they should be doing. I'm an optimist. Let's hope.
On that hopeful note, we will finally conclude day one. Thank you very much again, Juliet, for coming all the way out, for traversing the globe, particularly with us today. Your extensive experience has really fed into what we could do in the region to make it better. Not a sole state of affairs, but hopefully the quality standards can be implemented, whether in the short term or in the long term in the region. So thank you very much for sharing with us again. We are finally concluding day one now. Just a few pieces of housekeeping. Day two starts once again in this room at 9:30. For the international delegates, the pickup will once again be at 8:20 from the hotel lobby, departing at 8:30. 8:30, departing at 8:30, right? Yes, departing at 8:30. And if you are flying tomorrow afternoon and need to go straight to the airport from here, there will be an area for you to store your cases. So with that, thank you once again for your participation, and see you tomorrow.